So I'm Luke Weinhagen. I'm one of the applied theory guys with the Natural Law Institute. All right, so what that means is I got to turn all the stuff everybody else here does into some sort of, I've connected to some sort of accessible behavior, right? So what that really means is I'm turning the operational into actionable. We're going to play with some of that this morning, okay? So before I jump into the content itself, we're going to get active. Can't help myself. I'm rooting for the people. I got to get you doing something. So if you're willing to indulge me, we're going to do a real quick behavioral exercise this morning, all right? And it's going to come into play later in the presentation. So what I would like you to do, if you're on this side of the room, you're going to, when I say go, you're going to get up, you're going to go over to the other side of the room, and you're going to introduce yourself to somebody you haven't yet met. If you know everybody on the other side of the room, you're just going to greet somebody you haven't yet greeted this morning, all right? We're just going to take a few minutes to do that. If you're on this side of the room, you're just going to reciprocate. You're just going to introduce yourself and or greet someone that you haven't yet greeted this morning, all right? So let's go ahead and stand up. And go. That's all right. All right, once you're done, go ahead and sit back down so I know you're ready. All right, so I've got 3 goals here this morning. It's more teaching rather than just lecture for me, right? Whenever I'm in a room, I want you guys to walk away with something, so that's my goal here. I'm going to try to make it so you can quickly recognize what conditions need to exist for cooperation to be possible in any interaction you're having. I want you to be able to quickly diagnose whether an interaction you're engaged in meets the standard of cooperation, and I want to equip each of you to elevate your ability to take responsibility for cooperation in your interactions. All right, so that's my goal today. We're going to work through that. So, little behavioral exercise this morning. I'm sure some of you are wondering why I asked you to do that, right? And we'll get into that. We'll cover that. But for the purpose of our discussion, that's not the important question that I want you thinking about. The one that I really want you thinking about isn't why I asked you to do it. It's why did you do it, right? That's what I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. So what is cooperation, right? We asked Webster what cooperation is. It tells us that it's the action of someone being helpful, doing what's wanted, or common effort. So according to Webster, slavery is cooperation, right? According to Webster, the prison chain gang is a form of cooperation. Webster's wrong. Below that, you see the Natural Law Institute's definition of cooperation. This definition is accurate, it's complete, and it's operational, right? It is the scientific definition of cooperation, right? But remember what I told you my job is. It's to turn the actionable, or the operational, into actionable. So this morning I got to give you a new frame to work with, a frame you can carry with you so that you don't have to have a card you whip out with this definition on it every time you want to figure out if you're engaged in cooperation, right? So that frame, the new frame, before I put it up here, I want you to think of it, rather than a definition, but I want you to think of it more like a heuristic you can use to assess whether what you're experiencing or what you're engaged in is cooperation, right? So I'm not looking for a definition here. I'm looking for a tool, utilizable tool, all right? So cooperation exists as the behavioral expression of trust, right? It's how we manifest trust in our engagements with each other, right? So cooperation exists as the behavioral expression of trust. It's the way we use or we invest the resource of trust. It's how we spend trust with each other, right? Sometimes that investment is a good investment, right? We accomplish greater things than we can accomplish ourselves, right? So that's a good investment. It also returns a greater degree of trust to us if it's a good investment, right? There's an ROI of trust on that investment of trust, right? Sometimes the spend of trust is a bad investment, right? Where we walk away not accomplishing the goal with the failing in the relationship or the interaction, and where it actually reduces the amount of trust available to us in that space for interaction, right? Now we build trust in a lot of different ways. Every time our experiences meet our expectations, we're increasing the trust that we have available to us in that space where the experience is taking place. We build trust this morning. When you showed up at the building here today, the door was unlocked, right? You were able to walk in. You can see people working in the facility, right? All of these things are adding to the level of trust available to us to interact in this space, right? Some of you have seen me online. We've interacted, had conversations with each other. I've built trust with you, I hope, in those interactions, right? So we're building trust in all these little ways. The same is true for the Natural Law Institute, those of you that are familiar with it, if you're not new to it today. You've had experiences with them that builds trust. It's adding to that level of trust that we can spend on our interactions with each other, right? Those of you that aren't familiar with the Natural Law Institute, but are here because Brandon invited you, I'm spending the trust he's created with you in our interactions here today, right? So we pull trust in from all these little sources, right? Just little bits of trust from all these sources, and that becomes a resource for us to spend as we interact with each other, right? Going back to the exercise that I had you do this morning, the first question is, why did I have you do that, right? So I spent that trust, I spent Brandon's trust, I spent the Natural Law Institute's trust, I spent the trust of everybody in this room having you do a little behavioral experiment this morning, right? I did that for a couple reasons. One, I wanted you to have an experience in context of trust as the behavioral, or cooperation as a behavioral expression of trust. I wanted you to experience that. I wanted you to engage in that actual behavior this morning. So you had context for what we're talking about for the rest of the day. I also believe that when we do things like this, even a simple greeting, a simple introduction, we're increasing the amount of available trust in the room. So by just doing that simple behavioral experiment or exercise this morning, we've expanded our existing connections, or we've strengthened into new connections, we've strengthened our existing connections, and we've increased the amount of available trust in this space that we can tap into for further cooperation, right? So that brings us to the other question: why did you do it? Right? Did I put a gun to your head and say, you're going to do this exercise with me? Right? Did I ridicule you in front of the room until I got you to cooperate or got you to go along with it? Right? Didn't do any of that. Did I make any promises? Did I say I'm going to pay you later? Except for you. I mean, I think I told a couple of you I would. But right? Yeah. I told. I'm not gonna. Did I lie to you in any way, shape, or form? Did I promise something that I'm not going to deliver? Did I say, if you do this, I will give you, all the riches in the world, or anything like that? I made no promises. I made no commitments to you. I didn't threaten you. I didn't try to compel you in any way, shape, or form, right? So why did you do it, right? That's what we're going to get into next. Has anyone ever been stopped by the police, pulled over, stopped by the police, or anything like that, right? So we talked a little bit about cooperation being the behavioral expression of trust. Now I want to look at what cooperation is not, right? When you're stopped by the police, would any of you characterize that interaction as a form of cooperation? Now, nobody would, but we're all told frequently to cooperate with the police, right? So we're going to start building a distinction here, and it's going to be one of the important distinctions of this entire presentation. When that police officer stops you, he says, license, registration, how fast you're going, things like that. Do you have the option, as that interaction proceeds, to say, no thanks, and drive off? Right? What happens if you do that? Does the interaction end? No. Right. It escalates. The enforcement escalates. Right? So when you're in that situation, when you're in the police stop, when you're cooperating with the police, what you're actually doing is you're engaged in voluntary compliance. You're not engaged in cooperation. Right? And that's what the entire structure of law enforcement is built around, is voluntary compliance, not cooperation. And if we don't comply, it escalates to involuntary compliance, right? But we're conditioned, we're trained, we're taught that is a form of cooperation, right? And we're told over and over again that that kind of exchange is a form of cooperation. Cooperation actually requires choice. That's the big distinction between whether you're engaged in cooperation or you're not engaged in cooperation. That's why Webster was wrong. Slavery is not cooperation. It doesn't include choice. That's why our stop with the police officer is not cooperation. It doesn't include choice. It doesn't involve choice. Right? So choice is the absolutely essential element for cooperation. Sorry, catching up with my other hand here. All right, so let's take a look at why choice matters. So Cooperation is not coordination, right? That's a word that we often associate with cooperation, but we can perform coordination, think back to our chain gang, without choice. So coordination itself does not meet the standard of cooperation. It doesn't include choice. You can't say, I'm not going to do this. You don't have the choice about it. Same thing with obedience, right? How many of us have kids? Are we asking our children to cooperate with us when we're expecting obedience? No, we're not offering them choice, right? So that doesn't meet the standard of cooperation. Cooperation is not deference. Again, doesn't meet the standard of choice inherently, right? All of these things can exist in cooperation, but they do not by themselves meet the standard of cooperation. Acquiescence, assent, surrender, capitulation. None of these are inherently forms of cooperation. My favorite one, tolerance. Anyone that's seen me online knows how much I dislike this word. Tolerance is not inherently a form of cooperation. It doesn't inherently include the option of trust, right? Now we've got our list over here. This list are all things that can exist. They don't inherently deny cooperation. They can exist in cooperation, right? They don't prevent it. But if we don't have the voluntary element of the interaction, then those are not parts of cooperation. They're not expressions of cooperation. Over here, we start to see things that actually deny us the opportunity to cooperate. When we get into compulsion, when we get into coercion, intimidation, right? Forms of manipulation, deceit, fraud, and of course, voluntary compliance, right? All of these on this side, they deny cooperation, right? They undermine, they take us away from cooperation. Can you guys see how this works though? I mean, all of these, we do associate these words with cooperation, but the absolutely important element in there is choice, right? All right, so now we've got 2 points that we've covered in our talk here so far. We've got cooperation is the behavioral expression of trust, right? So now, given that, we can, each of us, take that heuristic with us, and as we're engaging with others and we're interacting in our day-to-day lives, we can figure out, is it even possible for cooperation to exist in this interaction? Is there trust that we can draw from to express as cooperation, right? So that's the first big point that I want you taken away from here. The second one is cooperation is not voluntary compliance. And we find this, we run into this all the time, right? From my view, looking at the way this works, if we look around at our expectations of behavior in all of our social settings, we're almost never actually operating under cooperation. This is our norm, this voluntary compliance. Right? And it's insidious because we've been trained and conditioned and taught that compliance is cooperation. Right? We do it, that's what all of our school systems are. That's what most of us do as parents. That's how we raise our kids. Right? Anytime you're at a job working for an employer, this is what they're asking of you. They're not asking for your cooperation. They're hoping you're going to be engaged in voluntary compliance, right? We've built our entire structure of civilization at this point, because of our level of dependence, we've built this as what cooperation is actually operating as, right? Is voluntary compliance, right? And it's it's insidious, right? It undermines everything you do. We're getting to the point now where we're so far away from cooperation that we don't even recognize that its lack. We don't even recognize it's gone, right? We're existing in this space, and we wonder why our ability to cooperate is deteriorating. We wonder why we keep losing access to cooperation, because we're not practicing it, we're not building it, we're not teaching our kids how to do this. Right? When's the last time, as a parent, as an instructor, as a member of a community that engages with children in the community, you intentionally created an opportunity for that child to refuse, to say no, where you actually gave them choice? It's terrifying, right? Even thinking about setting it up that way. Yet we expect our kids to go out in the world and interact with terrible and tough situations, peer pressure and things like that, and have the ability to say no, have the ability to make effective choices there. We don't even give them that opportunity in our own homes as we're developing their capacity to step into those choices, to navigate those kind of situations. All right, so it's huge that we recognize the distinction between voluntary compliance and cooperation. They are not the same. All right? That's my second big point. And with this distinction, if you can get this distinction, if you can grasp this distinction, then you're walking out of here able to diagnose and assess any interaction. Does it meet the standard of cooperation? Is there choice? Am I interacting with this person in all of my interactions, in this contract, in this negotiation, in this employer to employee situation, in this parent to child situation? Am I ensuring that I'm making choice available in this interaction? Am I preserving the opportunity for cooperation? Right? So this becomes a huge thing for each of us to take on. But we have to be able to recognize that cooperation is not voluntary compliance. Right? I hope I'm killing voluntary compliance for you. That's my goal here today. I want it dead, right? Two of my life goals are killing tolerance and killing compliance. Right? Those are
Luke, it's dying in the back.
Awesome. I'm not hearing the strangling sound, so that's what I'm looking for. All right. Excellent. All right, so now that we know what needs to exist in order for cooperation to emerge, right? We have to have that trust there. And now that we know how to diagnose whether we're engaged in cooperation, what do we do with it? Right? How do we start to apply that? How do we start to implement it? How do we start to take responsibility for it? All right?
You have children.
I have children, right. We start to learn and we start to practice saying no. No is the most important word in the concept of cooperation. Now, we associate cooperation with the affirmative, with yes, with assent, with agreement, right? We associate all of those things with cooperation. I want to change that association. I want you, in this experience, I want you to think about that yes is the most important word in compliance. Yes is not the most important word in cooperation. No is absolutely essential. It's required for cooperation to even exist.
Does that mean my wife is cooperating with me all the time?
If you cannot say no, you are not engaged in cooperation. In any interaction that you're having, that's the quick assessment you can always make. Right? If you're engaged in an interaction with another person, or entity, or organization, or anything like that, if you don't have a way to say no in that interaction, you are not engaged in cooperation. Right? And we can use that to start identifying when we're vulnerable, when we're under threat, when we're under pressure, when we're being coerced, when we're being manipulated. All that list of items that compromise cooperation, no is how we identify that in our interactions. If we cannot say no, if we feel like we cannot say no, if we feel under pressure to not say no, right? We're not engaged in cooperation, right? We're engaged in coercion, we're engaged in manipulation, we're not engaged in persuasion. Persuasion gives you the opportunity to say no, right? So, no is the most important word in cooperation. All right, so how do we start to learn, or where do we implement saying no, right? These are concepts I refer to frequently, so you may be familiar with some of them, but I'm going to go over them again today. Right? We start to put this into practice. Right? So we start exiting systems. This is a big one. So we have to identify and separate ourselves from the institutions and social structures that deny us the opportunity to say no. Now, I understand that that's an impossibility to completely remove ourselves from all these institutions. Right? They have the force, they have the power, things like that. But we want to minimize our footprint. We want to reduce our exposure to all of these things that deny us choice, that don't give us the option to say no, that make it impossible for us to engage in cooperation. I mean, it's crazy to me that our school systems, our governments, our businesses, all these things that emerged out of cooperation have been turned to the destruction and denial of cooperation. Mostly because we weren't paying attention. Right? Mostly because we weren't making that distinction of voluntary compliance being different from cooperation. Right? We can get them back by learning to say no. Right? But that starts by minimizing our footprint, by exiting the systems. We can develop competence, right? Identify where you can increase your own skill set to reintroduce choice into your interactions, right? So this means identifying where you're dependent on these systems, identifying where you can't function without those externalities, right? And closing that gap, building the skill sets so that you can function, so that when they come to you and say, take this experimental drug, or else, You're not worried about losing your job or not being able to go to the grocery store or not being able to go to the doctor or having your water shut off, right? Because you've developed the skills to accomplish those tasks regardless of the externality, right? So then you can say no, you have the choice. You've taken the responsibility for reintroducing choice into those interactions, right? You're not waiting for them to give you choice. That's not really choice. That's back into compliance, right? And then we have to practice it, right? We have to say no when it's uncomfortable to do so. We're very, very conditioned to saying yes, right? That's the social expectation across the West, is yes, is assent, is agreement. The problem is, because of that conditioning, because we're so out of practice in saying no, we're actually losing choice. We're losing access to choice. We're losing our ability to cooperate with each other. Again, no is the most important word in cooperation. So we have to build it back up. We have to retrain ourselves. We have to recondition ourselves out of agreement. Not because we don't want to cooperate, right? I mean, you guys getting, right? Because you guys getting that though? We want to restore actual cooperation. We want to move away from blind compliance and get back to actual cooperation, which means we have to be capable, competent, willing to say no, right? Even if we don't say no, you just have to be able to do it, right? And again, I just want to return because we're in the family section here, and so it's a really big deal to me that as you're interacting with kids, as you're raising kids, as you're teaching kids, as you're as a parent, our job is not to raise children, but to raise adults, right? So as we're doing that, as we're raising adults, we have to give them opportunities to practice saying no, especially with us as parents.
More practice.
Right. Well, for some of us, cooperation comes naturally. But really think about that. Think about how most kids are being raised right now, right? They're not being given genuine opportunities to say no to their own parents, and that's the safest place. That's where you have absolute control over the consequences of their saying no, right? But they're not being given the opportunity to develop the skill to put into practice saying no. We're destroying our kids' ability to engage in cooperation by not giving them that practice. And I don't mean that as an insult. None of us are paying attention to it. We're so conditioned for voluntary compliance that we're not even seeing that this dynamic exists, right? But we have to get back to cooperation. We have to build cooperation, and we have to pass it on. We have to give it to our kids, right? So if we want them to have any chance of having access to cooperation in the future, we have to start intentionally giving our kids opportunities to practice saying no to us as the parents that want to control everything, right? We have to be willing to be a little scared. And now doing that, if you are a parent, and if you're not, do it with the kids that you have access to, but it's going to help you get more comfortable saying no to other situations as well, right? With your kids, like I said, you have more control over the consequences of the situation, right? Out in the wild, you have less control of the consequences, but as you practice this, it gets easier and easier. As you practice this, it gets more effective for you. And as you practice this, opportunities for cooperation actually start to emerge, right? You start to see that this is an opportunity for cooperation. I don't have to just comply here. I don't have to just do what my boss tells me. We can find a way to communicate back and forth and reach a point of cooperation, right? I can do that with the people down at City Hall. I can do that with the people at the DMV sometimes, right? But we start to build.
What state do you live in?
Right. We start to build. Well, they're not expecting it. They're used to voluntary compliance from everybody. So you walk in there and tell them no, it stops them short. They don't know how to respond to it, right? So they have to stop and think, and that opens the door to exchange. That opens the door to cooperation that doesn't exist when voluntary compliance is the only thing that's happening there, right? So it's very, very powerful, and that's why it's so important we start to give our kids a chance to develop this, right? Is that making sense?
Yeah.
All right. And that's part of what I'm getting at with this kid here, what I call aggressive non-cooperation, right? So no is the most important word of cooperation. The expectation in society is assent, is compliance. So we have to get into the habit, we have to become champions of aggressive non-cooperation. We have to start, even when we don't necessarily need to, we have to start aggressively saying no in situations that present the opportunity for us to say no. Right? That's how we take responsibility for restoring cooperation in our broader communities.
So what you're saying is no is an act of responsibility.
It is an act of responsibility.
I like that.
But in our doing that, and our taking that responsibility on, we're teaching people that aren't familiar with our work, that aren't seeing, the presentations we do, the content we put out, we're teaching them the necessity of saying cooperation and how that doesn't mean the interaction ends. That means we have to find a way to work together to move the interaction forward, right? And that's the big piece that's missing. That's what we're losing is we lose cooperation, right? People are terrified of no. They're terrified of the word no. So the only way for us to change that is to start using it, to start reintroducing it to our interactions, right? And that's the responsibility that each of us has, right? So I talked about one of my goals here is to make sure that you guys are equipped, right, to elevate your interactions to the level of responsibility, right? Are you seeing how right now they're not? Right now they're sitting in the level mostly of voluntary compliance, right? A lot of our interactions are. But if we start to practice ourselves saying no, and we start to get aggressively non-cooperative, and the only reason I frame it that way is because I want you to be like a little assertive about it, right? Like I said, the expectation is assent, right? So you have to get yourself in the mindset, get yourself in the frame of, I'm going to walk around being a champion for no today. I'm going to walk around being a champion for cooperation today. And that's part of the responsibility, simply because you're viewing this.
Get a video camera and walk around and fuck with people doing this.
Yeah.
Afternoon.
It's a great...
Just to see, that's a great social science experiment.
Right.
Just say, no.
Yeah, and you don't have to be a jerk about it. You're just saying, no, I'm not going to just do that. Tell me why I should do that. Right? It's a simple conversation to have, right? Just don't immediately jump to assent. Don't immediately jump to yes. Every time you just jump to yes, you're killing cooperation and you're building up voluntary compliance. Right? You're just adding more voluntary compliance into our society. You're adding more voluntary compliance into our culture, and you're destroying the preservation of cooperation. Right? So we need to get that into our behavior. Right? We need to get that into our practice. Right? No is a very, very powerful word.
Is this why people call me a dick?
There's lots of reasons that people call you a dick. That's a whole separate presentation. It's nothing but lists.
Probably a whole separate conversation.
Right, yeah. I talked a little bit earlier about how trust is an asset. It's a resource that's available to us in our interactions, right? We spend it in the form of cooperation, right? And we really do, right? Anytime that we're engaging with each other in a manner of cooperation, we're not killing each other and we're not running away from each other, right? We're engaging in cooperation. That means we're trusting that the other person isn't going to kill us. We're trusting that the other person isn't going to rob us. We're trusting that they're not going to destroy whatever it is we're trying to, or mislead us, right? And fraud's a big one, right? Fraud's one of those ones that removes the ability to cooperate because you're not operating from the same frame, right? So you can't even engage on a common goal there because there is no common goal there, right? There's the deception's in place, right? But what I want you taken away from this one is that trust is a resource, right? So when it comes to other resources, right, who is responsible for how you invest your money? Right? Is somebody else responsible for that, or are you responsible for that? Right? You are, right? You're responsible for that. We're taught, we're trained, and it's accurate that you have to take responsible for how you spend, how you invest your money. Who's responsible for how you invest your time? Right? A lot of us really would like somebody else to take responsibility for that, but we are responsible for how we invest our time. Who's responsible for how you invest your trust? It's no different. It's no different than any of the other resources that we have available to us. You're responsible for how you invest your trust. You're also responsible for misallocating your trust, for investing it poorly, right? You're responsible for recognizing the distinction between voluntary compliance and cooperation. You're responsible for these things, right? So we covered our 3 points, and these are the big takeaways, right? You remember we talking about my goals at the beginning of the talk here this morning. Trust is the behavioral, or cooperation is the behavioral expression of trust, right? If you walk out of here with that tool, then you can always recognize whether or not any situation permits the emergence of trust, right? You can identify it in any interaction, okay? Second big point, the second one I really want you taken away from here, voluntary compliance. Trust or cooperation is not voluntary compliance, right? That's the hard one. The fraud, the manipulation, the coercion, the compulsion, we recognize pretty easily that those are not cooperation. But this is huge. This is a big one, guys. We're doing this everywhere. We're mistaking voluntary compliance for cooperation, and we've got to stop doing that. Right? So if you can walk out of here with this, right, then now you're equipped to rapidly identify and diagnose whether any interaction you're engaged in meets the standard of cooperation. Right? And then in order to cooperate, in order to take responsibility for cooperation, in order to be the responsible party spending the resource of trust, you have to learn to say no. You have to get good at it. It has to be part of who you are. You have to develop the skill. Right? No. Kids are born learning how to do this, right? And then we beat it out of them. We spend their whole lives beating it out of them. We put them in environments where they're not allowed to do it. We teach them they're not allowed to do it. We condition them they're not allowed to do it. So we all reach adulthood not knowing how to say no. And look around at the problem that's causing. Look around at the issues that emerge because of that. Look at how little cooperation we're actually engaged in.
This is kind of what happens when you live in a society that sets up the education system for 100 years to turn human beings into basically a workforce resource.
Yeah, it is. I don't give parents a break by sending their kids to school. So that's asking somebody else to take responsibility for you. It's not you taking responsibility. So.
That was a clap worthy.
All right. So the big thing here, right? Cooperate responsibly. That's the big takeaway, right? And now you've got the 3 points that I believe are necessary to do this. Right? Does that make sense?
No, you're good at this. You make a living doing this, don't you?
Something like that. All right. So I got a little bit. I went a little faster, cut some things out, trying to catch us back up. Do we have any questions? Does this concept make sense? Yes. Right? Is those 3 points? I'm going to actually go back to those. I want those on the screen, not this. Right? This is huge. You guys walk out of this. You've upgraded your skill set today. Mm-hmm. Right? This is the big thing that I want you taking away from my talk with you this morning. Right? All the other words don't matter if you can get these 3 things. Cooperation is the behavioral expression of trust. Right? So that means if you can't find trust there, you can't find cooperation there. It doesn't exist. Right? It can't be found. Cooperation is not. And I leave volunteer. We have that whole list. I put that whole list up. But this is the big one because this is the insidious one. This is the dangerous one. This is the trap. Right? So cooperation is not voluntary compliance. Right? The cop is not asking for you to cooperate with him. If you think he is, you're going to end up dead. Right? Society works the same way. It's not asking you to cooperate with it. And if you think it is, it's going to end up dead. And in order to cooperate, you got to grow up and learn to say no. Right? We've got to get ourselves out of the habit of voluntary compliance. Yeah, it is absolutely, yeah.
It's responsibility against.
Yeah. I want everyone to hear you.
All right. So I want to unpack one area. I love the presentation. Just one thing kind of stood out for me as something we should disambiguate.
Yeah.
That in the Middle East, which is a low trust society, it's very common that if you get cheated, you applied your trust to them, you're the sucker. Right? But in the West, we don't have that. We have high trust commons. Okay, maybe that's the distinction. We have high trust commons, or somewhere in that spectrum. How do you say, well, you misapplied your trust? But usually if somebody cheats them, you're like, okay, they're the bad guy, not you. So maybe get a little bit more into the misapplication of trust.
Yeah, and that's a big, everyone heard him, right? He had the mic, right? So, responsible doesn't mean at fault for the mistakes of, but it means you are responsible for the costs, the consequences, the outputs of the occurrence. Now, one of the things I'm hoping with stuff that we're doing as a group and that I'm doing with people is that I'm equipping you to protect yourself against that kind of exposure. Right now, that's a vulnerability. And we talked about, you talked about places specifically like the Middle East. There's not a whole lot of cooperation going on over there. Right? They're heavy into compliance. Those are very compliant civilizations, right? That's what they're, things like Sharia law and so those are systems of compliance. Those are not systems that support, build, or produce cooperation, right? So they have an entire structure. They're a great example to look to where we don't want to go, why it's important for us to preserve, to actively, intentionally preserve the opportunity for cooperation, right? We want to really make, it's hugely important. I mean, the entire West is built on cooperation, right? I mean, the whole concept of a division of labor exists only where we have access to cooperation, right? We don't want to lose it. It's a huge resource to us, right? I mean, it's like a force multiplier for progress, right? And so we don't want to lose it. But we can look around the world and see, almost everywhere else, they're not engaged in cooperation. They don't have choice. You can't say no there. You get stoned if you say no. You get tossed off a building if you say no, or if you say no, right? You get thrown in prison. You get gulagged if you say no, right? Those aren't situations where choice exists. Those are not situations where cooperation can even emerge, right? So we lose access to all of them, right? I mean, I had that list up there before of the stuff that it's possible for it to exist when we are engaged in cooperation, right? All of the positives there, not the ones that take away from cooperation, but all the positives there, those are superpowers only so long as we have choice. The moment we lose choice, the moment we sacrifice choice, the moment we give up choice, the moment we forfeit choice, which is really what we're doing, those become vulnerabilities instead of superpowers, and they get used against us, right? All of the coordination, all of those things. I mean, they really are. That's how we magnify each other through cooperation, right? Those are the mechanisms of that, and they're fantastic tools to use, right? But the minute we set choice aside, the minute we drop choice, they become weapons to be used against us instead of tools we get to use to build, right? And that's where we got to go. Any other questions about cooperation today?
That was awesome talk. Pretty straightforward. He does this for a living.
All right.